Hello, my name's Alex Brooke and I'm from Epsford Environmental, and welcome to this Property Care Association webinar on underwater alien plants. Now this has been put together because this week it is Invasive Species Week, and here I hope to raise a little bit of awareness about some of the common aquatic freshwater plants. So the focus is going to be on, as the title suggests, invasive non-native species, but within the aquatic freshwater environment. I'm just going to cover a selection of species and touch on the impacts on the environment, management, and similarities, differences of management to some of the terrestrial invasive non-native species. So, what are invasive non-native species? Well, quite simply, they're animals or plants that have been introduced deliberately or accidentally by humans to an area from which they do not naturally occur. And these species, when they've been introduced, either threaten biological diversity or have other unforeseen impacts on the built environment, on waterways, etc. There are some other similar terms. These are things like non-native species, alien species, invasive alien species. Why are they invasive? Well, when they're moved to a new geographic location, they're quite often moved there without their natural enemies. So they're freed from their enemies. And when they come to the new location, they can outcompete native species because these native species haven't been freed from their natural enemies. So within the aquatic environment, we've got ponds, lakes, rivers, canals, etc. And some of the invasive weeds are what we call submerged weeds. Now, this includes species such as Canadian waterweed, or sometimes referred to as Canadian pondweed. That's quite a common one, and quite often it's a catch-all name for all of these sort of bottle brush looking species underneath the water surface. But there's also Nuttall's waterweed and curly waterweed. Now, the Canadian waterweed and Nuttall's waterweed were introduced in the mid-1800s, and Nuttall's waterweed 1966, and they came from North America. Curly waterweed was introduced in the mid-20th century from Southern Africa. All of these were introduced as aquatic ornamentals for oxygenating ponds and aquariums, etc. And here we have the classic sort of bottle brush image of Canadian waterweed. The other types of weeds are what we call emergents. So these are species such as Parrots Feather, which is rooted within the sediment, but also has the upper part of the plant sticking out of the top of the water. So it's emerged out of the surface. Now, Parrot's Feather was introduced in the 60s, and that came from South America, also another oxygenating plant for aquariums, ponds, etc. There's another view of Parrot's Feather, and here we can see close up of the leaves, and you'd see that it's got these fronds rising from each of the leaf stems. Now, the other types of weeds of what we got are free floating. So this will be species such as water fern or Azola, it's, a lot of people know it as. Here we can see some Azola covering a large pond. And we also have floating Pennywort. Now, this was introduced again as a pond ornamental in the 1980s from the Americas. And this forms dense mats over large water bodies, rivers, etc. The other type of species we got are what we call marginal or amphibious. And this includes species such as New Zealand pygmy weed or Australian swamp stonecrop, introduced in the early part of the 20th century from Australia and New Zealand. Here we can see it submerged beneath the surface. So it does actually tick the boxes of most of these environments that we've been through so far. So submerged, emergent, but also marginal and amphibious. Here we see it in its sort of tightly cropped grass form along the side of a lake. Now, how to identify New Zealand pygmyweed. So what we've got here on the left, we can see that the leaves are opposite. They're in pairs, but opposite, and they cross like a cruciform, which is what we call alternate. And where the leaves join the stem, they form a collar. That's in the middle picture. The stem is round, and on the right-hand side, we can see the roots arising from the nodes that are distributed along the stem. Now, the leaves are quite often fleshy and up to about 2 centimeters long, but they're not notched like calatrice, which is a native species. And here we can see the amphibious form in flower. Now, this would be from the sides of a lake bank. And here again, we can see crassula. All of that is crassula on the bottom part of the photograph. So, what about New Zealand pygmyweed? Well, it's a perennial plant. It's not always obvious when it's buried beneath the water surface. It roots within the sediment or within the soils of the surrounding the water's edge. It prefers slow water, so ponds, lakes, some slow flowing rivers and canals. It spreads via fragments and can snag up on fishing kit. And here on the right, we can see the current distribution across the UK. So here's another picture. All of this that you can see along the shoreline of this reservoir is crassula in its amphibious form. Again, this is a close-up of crassula in its amphibious form. Now, this was actually taken from an area of land that was previously part of a cement works. So it's not far from the actual lake, but within this area, ephemeral ponds form. So these are temporary ponds. And with this sort of frequent dousing of water and then dryness, the crassula or New Zealand pygmyweed can actually survive. And here we see some of the New Zealand pygmyweed being washed up on the shoreline. So you can imagine that being picked up on fishing gear, on boats, etc., and then possibly transported unwittingly to another site where it can establish. It can also form patches within reed beds and damp woodland. And here you see it, it's quite sort of a lush, upright green amongst the reeds. It's also quite robust in that it's resilient to trampling. So here we can see little divots from where livestock have been taking in water. And amongst those little divots are newly establishing patches of New Zealand pygmyweed. The other problem that we have is that it can be an issue within the built environment and also within the water industry. So here we've got a part of a sewage treatment works. Can't actually see any crassula there at the moment, but if you look in the bottom gully, the drainage section was full of crassula. So obviously this is part of the final stages of sewage treatment and could be an issue spreading from that area into a watercourse. So, New Zealand pygmyweed. So, going back to when it's in its amphibious form, the actual Latin name for New Zealand pygmyweed is Crassula helmsii. Now, these plants, these Crassulaceae, are quite special in the way that they are adapted to being resilient to drought, in that they utilize this system called Crassulanic acid metabolism. So this basically means that the plant stores or actively takes in carbon dioxide at night, where the impact of drought is lesser than during the day. So it stores this carbon dioxide in various biochemical forms, and then during the day, the pores on the leaf are closed, and it's absorbing sunlight, and it utilizes the carbon dioxide stored from the night before to photosynthesize and produce energy. So it's a way, it splits absorbing the light, obviously during the day, with the absorption of carbon dioxide at night, and then does completes the photosynthesis during the day. So management of this weed is particularly difficult because it's very small and low growing when it's amphibious on the margins of the lakes. Now you can, in certain situations where there's small ponds, you can scrape those areas, but generally you need to take the between 15 to 20 centimeters of the substrate from which it's growing. But large lakes can be difficult due to the amount of submerged weed within the area, and also because a lot of the weed underneath the water is thriving, and the fact that we have no herbicides that we can use within the water, that makes control difficult, and it spreads via very small fragments. So the quantities, if you can imagine, on very large reservoirs. Now, if you look at this picture here, the yellow is the visible New Zealand pygmy weed around a huge reservoir, and that New Zealand pygmy weed covers an area of about 32 hectares. That's just the visible New Zealand pygmy weed. So if you were to take a 20 centimetre scrape of all that visible New Zealand pygmy weed, you'd end up with about 65,000 metres cubed. Now that's a huge quantity. And to give you an idea of what that looks like, I took that volume and produced a little scale model. So here we can see that 65,000 metres cubed of scraped up crassula in a nice uniform cube parked just outside Buckingham Palace. Now that's something to think about when you're trying to manage weeds like this, is that the volumes can be horrendous, and the fact that small fragments can be easily spread. So, floating pennywort. Now, this again is a perennial, and it's obvious when you see it because it forms these huge mats floating on top of the water's surface, and it's relatively frost tolerant. Sort of tends to survive around the margins of ponds or lakes or along the edges of watercourses during the winter, and then starts to boom in the spring and summer. Again, this is another species that spreads via fragments. So here we've got some close-ups of the floating pennywort, and you can see these dividedly. So here on the right we've got floating pennywort, and on the left we've got the native pennywort. So on the right, the floating pennywort, you can see that there's a divide between where the stem meets the leaf, and it's quite divided and crinkly around the edge of the plant, whereas the native species on the left is more entire, more sort of intact and whole. So here again we've got some floating pennyworts, and this is in flower. Now this is another image of floating pennywort established within a marina along the River Thames. And again, floating pennywort covering a lake along a river, another river near some livestock. And this can cause obvious issues with livestock. Here we have Trevor Reynolds' famous picture of the sheep stuck in floating pennywort. So water fern, again, this is another one of these free-floating organisms, and you can see the current distribution in the map on the right. So a close-up of water fern, you'll see that it's actually not particularly big. It's a few centimeters across. It's got these sort of greeny, pinky, scale-like leaf sections to it. Now, managing this weed can be quite problematic. So, essentially, when you go to manage something like water fern or pennywort, you need to sort of think about decision tree. So what are the stand characteristics? So that's what's the characteristics of the water body? Is it a recent infestation or is it an established large infestation? So if it's a recent infestation, can you access it? If you can, then try and contain it, collect it, physically remove it, and put it within the on the bank where it can't be washed back in again. If it's not accessible, then try and contain it. There might be the possibility to use herbicide control or mechanical control, but there is also the option of biological control. So, a former colleague of mine, Corinne Pratt, has kindly given me a few photographs of the Azola, what's commonly known as the Azola Weaver, which is Stenopelmus rufinaceus. So this little weevil, which is a type of beetle, is native to the Americas, and it was identified in Britain in the early 20th century. And it's classed as ordinarily resident. So that means that it's been here for many, many years. It's persisting in the natural environment, but it's surviving on what remnants or patches of Azola, which has been released into the environment. Now, the larvae is most damaging. And so if we have a look here, so this is a water body in Surrey. I actually know this one quite well. This, you can see on the water surface, is covered in Azola. Now, the weevils were released and they started munching away and breeding, and then the larvae started eating away at the plants. And then after a couple of months, you end up with no Azola. And of course, because the weevil is host specific, that the population of that organism also drops back. So another ex-colleague of mine I'd spoken to, Jamie, she's been working on a biological control agent of floating pennywort. So this, like pennywort, comes from the Americas. This weevil is from South America, and it's been host range tested, and it's currently going through the process of pest risk assessment and hopefully going to be approved. So here we can see the weevil and what it does to the leaves of floating pennywort. It also has a larval stage which bores into the stem of floating pennywort and eats away at the plant. So hopefully at some point we won't have scenes like this along rivers. Okay, so Parrots Feather. Well, the distribution of this isn't quite as dramatic as some of the other species, but it's one of these species that is increasing in its distribution across the UK. So, as we saw earlier, it has these fine fronds along the leaf edge. And when you take a cross section of it, you can see that it's actually quite distinctive. Now, there are a number of other species that look quite similar, so I'd encourage everybody to maybe pick up a copy of the Invasive Plants and Animals in Britain book by Boy, Wade and Roy. That's a very useful starting text to sort of familiarise yourself with some of these aquatic plants. And it also enables you to source other information. And here we are with some more pictures of Parrot's Feather. And to sort of get an idea of the impact that it can have, here we have a large pond with a quite significant infestation of Parrot's Feather. So, now on to Canadian pondweed. So this is the one that everybody's familiar with. Now here I've sort of mainly shown the map of the distribution of Canadian pondweed. Nuttall's waterweed and curly waterweed, the distribution is not quite as dramatic as this, but because they're quite often lumped together in terms of people having problems with these types of weeds, I've sort of kept them quite sort of general and together. So it's rooted in the sediment. With Canadian pondweed, only the female plant is present in the UK, so that means it's spread by fragments of plant. It tends to be in slow water, and it's a real pain to fishermen. I've spent many times having conversations with fishermen about them having an absolute nightmare with this species, and it just fouling all their lines and nets, etc. Now, of course, that's a risk if they don't clean their kit and move on to a different place, but most of them generally are so fed up with it, they like to get rid of all of it from their kit. So let's have a look at the differences between these three species. So on the left, we've got Nuttall's waterweed, and in the middle, we've got Canadian pondweed, and on the right, we've got curly waterweed. Now you'll see that curly waterweed and Canadian pondweed look superficially similar, but one of the main ways to try and tell the difference between curly waterweed and Canadian pondweed is that on the leaves of curly waterweed there are very, very fine small teeth, and these can be seen here. So those orange arrows, that shows you where the little teeth are along the edge of the curly waterweed. Now you'll need a hand lens to be able to see that, so that's like a watchmaker's hand lens, about ×10 magnification. You can pick those up quite cheaply from various online sources. So what about managing these weeds? Well, there aren't any herbicides available which you can put into water, which is a good thing. But also there's no specific biological control. So it really comes down to mechanical and cutting and shade, things like that. And it's always going to be an ongoing management. With a lot of these aquatic weeds, there's always going to be an element of continual management. Some of the terrestrial weeds, things like Japanese knotweed, are relatively easy to control compared to, say, something like New Zealand Pygmy weed, because remember that covers vast areas of huge reservoirs and lakes, and there aren't chemicals that you can put into the water, and if you were to try and excavate it, then you're talking of millions upon millions of gallons of water that you'd have to dewater, scrape away, and if you leave any fragments, it will come back. Whereas generally with some of the terrestrial ones, they are much easier to contain and manage. So with Canadian pondweed, it's, you know, hand pulling small infestations, putting it on dry banks where it can't be washed away or unwittingly transported away, or mechanical removal. So, as I say, expect ongoing management with things like these submerged aquatic water weeds. Management such as this, where huge quantities can exist within relatively small ponds. So it will be an ongoing process. So finally, now biosecurity has always been one of those things that sometimes you will get blank faces look at you when you talk about biosecurity, but I think over the past year, unfortunately, we've all become familiar with this. So think of it as hands, face, space, but it's almost that. But with aquatic weeds, we need to think of check, clean and dry. So basically, have you got any weeds within your water body? Is it on any of your kit, your boats, your fishing gear? If it is, clean it off, dry it, make sure you can't spread that weed further. So I'd just like to say a big thanks to everybody for listening, and thank you to Corinne Pratt and Jamie DeJour from Cabby for some of the updates on the biocontrol. Thanks to Trevor Reynolds for the famous sheep photo. And I'd also like to thank Aquatic Solutions for the use of some of their photos, and also the online resources that are freely available, such as from the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat. Thank you.